Hello, everyone. I am here with Simon Binder, who came all the way from Sweden to be on this virtual interview with me. Uh, Simon, I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and still be in the comfort of the Swedish cold summer. My name is Simon. Like we've said, I work as a principal security and workplace architect at a telco based in Sweden. I'm also a dual MVP within both Microsoft Intune, which is the focus of this, together with Jamf, and within Azure Virtual Desktop. For the context, I'm also a person that I've spoken at JNUC, so Jamf Nation User Conference, 4 times up to this point. So I have knowledge both about Jamf and Intune, but Intune is where I have my technical background, and I'm very happy to be here and hopefully clarify a few questions that many of you that work with Jamf have about Intune and how the integrations work and what Intune can and can't do. So thank you for having me.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for joining us. So the first question I have for you, Simon, is something we talked about in our last interview.
Mhm.
But I'm wondering if there is a way to set up zero-touch provisioning similar to how we do with like dep notify or Swift dialog or any of those workflows that have onboarding screens.
Yeah. So from an Intune point of view, you can't really do anything natively. Then you get the regular kind of Intune enrollment, where you just go through the native experience of macOS together with some prompts that will help you enroll into Intune and also set up the identity side of it. What I tend to find that organizations that wants that zero touch experience with those notifications, with that interactivity does, is using Octary, which you can integrate with Intune. There are some caveats with that too, since we don't have the ability to tell Intune when something should happen in a certain sequence. So what I tend to find is that you deploy Octary. Once you do the enrollment, Octary will take care of notifications and interactivity. And then you use, again, additional third-party tools in many cases to deploy the applications and do them in a certain order. But natively, Intune do not have the same capabilities as Jamf have in terms of that very nice and user-friendly enrollment where you have a zero-touch experience.
Yeah. So there's two issues I found with
Mhm.
Intune. I just wanted to get more clarification when it comes
Yeah.
to zero touch provisioning.
Mhm.
So the first one is that I can't control when specific, I'll call them policies, even though that's
Yeah.
not really the right term in Intune, but
Mhm.
when specific policies get deployed, that's
Mhm.
scripts, configurations, and most importantly, apps.
Yeah.
So you can't use like a custom trigger. Is that correct?
Yeah. Natively in Intune, and that's across all platforms. It's no difference in between Windows, Mac OS, iOS, Android from that point of view. You can't control the order of when things are applied. There are things you can do to make it a little simpler, since, as you said, policies or profiles are the first things that gets applied because they have no um,
Mhm.
prerequisites for anything else to be on the device when it applies. Then, when you have the management extension and everything happens in the MDM stack, then scripts and applications will be pulled down and executed in any random order. And that might differ from Mac to Mac, from day to day. You really have no ability to control the order of neither policies, scripts, or applications. On Windows, you have capabilities to do things on demand to a certain extent, and you can trigger based on things that happens on the device. But those abilities are not in the Mac OS side just yet. So today, you have no ability to control the order of neither of those things. So you need to be a little clever in terms of how you deploy them, what you ask users to self-service to, or that you build things that don't rely on a certain order, which in some instances might be hard. And what I find that I do myself is to do a lot of scripting and just deploy scripts with built-in logic to make that more simplistic, or use open source uh, components like Monkey to do similar
Mhm.
things.
Yep. So the second thing I've seen that that's problematic,
Hmm.
and you can give some clarity on this, is similar to the first one. There's no way to for me to say I want this to install first, or I want this to install during the setup assistant, specifically when it comes to like a script or a package. Is that also correct?
Yep, that is correct. You don't have the ability to tell it when something should be installed. So you can't bootstrap things to the enrollment process, which again makes it complicated to do. And that's why, like I said before, if you want something to happen during setup and it's essential that it's there before you go any further, um, then you need to use something like Octary to do that with Intune today. I know that this is an area where Microsoft have received a lot of feedback from myself and a lot of others. So it's something they definitely are aware of and are working on. I think that's one of the areas where you really can see how close of a relationship that Jamf and Apple has, and where Microsoft is trying to catch up. So I definitely think we'll see something in the future, but currently you have no ability to do that apart from scripting it yourself.
Yeah. So, but even with scripting, and I'm curious also how Octary would work. So typically, if I
Mhm,
was going to deploy something like dep notify or Swift
mhm,
dialog, I would make sure in Jamf specifically,
mhm.
I would have it use the enrollment complete trigger, or I would put both the package and the script into one package that I deploy in the pre-stage enrollment. But neither of those things I can do on Intune. So for me, I guess it would pop up at some point, but there'd be no way to control whether it would pop up right away or whether it would pop up 5 or 10 minutes into the process of enrolling the computer. Is that kind of a correct assumption?
Yeah, and the way you can do it, like you can tell it to wait, if I'm not mistaken. You can do that on iOS, at least. I think that's been rolled out to macOS too, that you can ask it to wait for this to happen before you let someone in. The challenge with that, and again, that's the same on Windows, is that if you have multiple things, so
Hmm.
multiple scripts, multiple applications, you have no ability to control in which order they happen. So the most common example is, say that you deploy uh, something that will help you during the enrollment stage, but you also deploy 4 scripts, you deploy the Microsoft 365 apps, you deploy a lot of other things. You have no control over in which order this will happen, which might mean that it would take a normal enrollment 5 minutes because that's the
Yeah.
only app you need. And then you can be let into the Mac. But if you're unlucky, it will install everything else first, and you have to wait 35 minutes for it to happen. So that's
Gotcha.
where, yeah. So I think you're able today to actually control what should happen before you're allowed into the Mac, but that is very limited. Um, and therefore it might also be a very negative user experience. And that's one of the reasons why we, both on uh, autopilot for Windows or uh, whichever enrollment method you choose for Mac OS, mostly try to make like this is the absolute minimum. This is the only things we make required at all. Um, and then we wait until the operating system is up and running, and then we deploy the rest. And we can do that in various ways. But with
Mm.
Intune, it's mostly that on Mac OS that we need some components for that to work. So it usually turns out in a relatively good way in terms of timing, but it will still take a while for it to happen. And therefore, we are less, uh, we more seldom do that
Hmm.
setup in terms of Mac OS than we do on Windows because the control layer is so uh, challenging today.
Yeah.
And
So
I think we
basically,
yeah, we talked about that the
go
last
ahead.
time as well. That uh, I think it's important to remember that if you are a Windows admin or you're a company that are just onboarding the first Macs, if you don't have the experience of using Jamf or using Macs in general, you will probably be very happy with the experience you get from Intune because you don't know what you could get more. And that's something I think we'll see more and more organizations realizing over time when users starts to require a better level of service, a better user experience, and where the current state of Intune will prevent that from happening. But I think that's an important consideration, especially for organizations which has both Macs and Windows, and where the Windows side isn't aware of all the things you can do with Jamf or the other tools that you have access to, and therefore they feel that okay, this is a good enough experience. And I think that's the main thing I try to drive home when it comes to speaking to my customers. What is really good enough? And is it good enough because you don't know what you could get? Or is it good enough because it's actually what your users are asking for?
Mhm.
But so far, everything you have said is correct. Like you have no ability to control the order of things, when things happen, what to wait for, apart from doing scripts. And like you say, even if you do scripts, it might be a lot of like dependencies and things that need to happen in a certain order, and therefore you need to build a lot of logic into it. Or again, like we have touched on a couple of times, use third-party or open source tools to create that experience that organizations want in terms of their full macOS rollout.
Cool. I want to get back to something you said
Mm-hmm.
before.
Yep.
So you talked about how this is kind of setting up zero-touch provisioning with these provisioning windows is kind of possible, but you're waiting for the whole configuration to come down.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to clarify what that is. Now I'm going to just share my screen quick. Is that this thing you're talking about right here, await final configuration? And this is the enrollment program tokens.
Yes.
Perfect.
And I think if you hover over the little information bar, it will or window, then it will the first devising completes, which means that it will sync it. It will wait for them to be reported back to Intune. And I'm actually not entirely certain how much it will wait for, because this is specifically for settings, as I read it. It might not impact things like scripts and apps.
Yeah, so it's only for configuration profiles. So you're still going to have the same problem with scripts and apps and that stuff. Because, with Octary, with Depth Notify, with Swift Dialog, with any solution that has onboarding windows, you need to install something. And nothing will happen. No onboarding windows will come up until that thing is installed. And that's where I see this issue being. If I can't set a priority, an order, or anything, it could get installed last. And all it would do, theoretically, is pop up and say your configuration is complete because everything's already been done. It's been 10, 15 minutes. So that's why, technically you can set up this stuff even with something like Octary, with third-party tools. And Octary is a paid tool. But there are some predictable ways that it's going to fail on a regular basis. So I would say, and just to sum up what you were saying, it's possible, it's not recommended. If you're going to use Intune, probably just don't try to use these provisioning windows and keep it a little simpler.
Yeah, exactly. And again, going back to what I said, a lot of the organizations that get going with Intune are relatively new to macOS management. Their users are probably first generation macOS users within that organizations. They might have used Macs previously, but within that organizations, they are relatively new. Therefore, a lot of organizations obviously go for what they have access to at the moment, which is Intune. And that's the way they get onboarded. And therefore, they are relatively happy with the experience they have. But as soon as you get to the point where we now want this, where enrollment gets more complicated, where the users expect a more full service management from their IT, then you hit these challenges as you're explaining now, where security teams might say, hey, we need to ensure that before this user can sign into our network, they need to have some kind of EDR deployed. And
Hmm.
currently that is very complicated to do with Intune, aside from extensive scripting.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I'm going to get into my second question.
Mhm.
So, explain to me how user affinity works and how it differs from Jamf Connect.
Yeah. And I think that is something I really would like to hear your views on, because user affinity in the way that we usually use Intune is that when you enroll a device, it's in most cases, or I would say it like this: when you enroll a Mac device in Intune, it's always assumed that it's a personal device. You can do shared Macs, but that's something that I personally recommend against in many instances. Uh, you can do it with Jamf, but with Intune, I ask most of my customers to avoid it. So in
J-
Intune, it's
j-
assumed that, yeah, go ahead.
oh, just one point of clarification. You said personal
Yeah,
device. Did you mean
yeah,
one-to-one device?
yes, one-to-one device. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, good clarification. So we're not talking a BYOD. It's a
Yes. Yes.
one-to-one device. Yeah, so
Yeah.
very good point. So in Intune, we always assume that the device is a one-to-one relationship for macOS.
Hmm.
Therefore, user affinity will mainly play out for Macs in terms of if you have a user that enrolls a Mac, applications and profiles that are deployed to that user or assigned to that user will affect all the Macs where which he or she have enrolled. Um, and that's basically the only user affinity there is for Mac OS. Windows in Intune, it's a different way, because then you have things like primary users and so on, where you have more of a shared device state. But for Mac OS and Intune, it's always assumed that it's a one-to-one relationship between the user and the device. If the user happens to have multiple devices, it's still assumed that it's only that user that uses that device, and every setting, every app, every configuration you send to that user will be applied to all of those Macs. You
Hmm.
can do filtering for various things on the profiles, so that it ensures that, yes, you might have 3 different machines. 2 of them might be a single purpose machine or whatever it might be. You can filter those out. But in general, we assume that whatever you assign to the user will apply to all of the devices which that user have enrolled, and nothing else will happen. The same goes for in terms of identity, and I think that's most applicable on either the SSO extension or the new platform SSO feature, where it's the user that enrolls that will create the initial account and therefore use the SSO extension or platform SSO. Now, there are settings that, especially for platform SSO, will allow multiple users to sign in and create new user objects on the Mac if you allow them to do so.
Hmm.
But that will mean that you will have conflicts, because if you have 4 different users with 4 different policies signing into the same Mac, all of those policies will actually apply. And depending on
Hmm.
which setting it is, you might have very, very odd results from
Hmm.
that. So, in general, and I would say that don't have a single customer of mine that are using shared Macs today with Intune.
Yeah.
It doesn't prove that problematic, but that's basically what we see in terms of user affinity when it comes to both device management as well as identity management from an Entra point of view.
Gotcha. Yeah. So to recap, Jamf Connect can use multiple users pretty easily on a
Hmm.
single computer.
Yep.
With Intune,
Hmm.
user affinity doesn't really do that.
Nope.
Couple more clarifying questions just on features. So I'll
Hmm.
list off kind of the features of Jamf Connect. First of all, we have Jamf
Yep.
Connect login. That is
Hmm.
going to provision the user account the first time that they log in.
Yep.
And let's just
Hmm.
assume a one-to-one environment.
Yeah.
Then you have the Jamf Connect application. That
Hmm.
application keeps the password of the identity provider in sync with the local computer's password, along with the file vault password. And
Hmm.
then inside of that application, you also have other features like being able to produce Kerberos tokens if you're
Hmm.
connected to the local network, um, allowing you to change your password through the portal and stuff like that. Um,
Hmm.
if we look at each of those features, does User Affinity do all the same things?
So if you had asked me 1.5 months ago, I would say that no, that's not possible. Today, with Platform SSO, that, as far as I'm aware, does all of those things. For the Kerberos part, it will use the Intune SSO extension to create those tokens. But today, Platform SSO will allow you to sign in, create your account, hold all of that information for you, give you single sign-on to whichever resource you like, and also allow you to do an actual online sign-in to Entra every single time you sign in, which to me is the
Mhm.
biggest thing and something that a lot of my customers have asked for. Do note that this isn't a Intune feature as such. Platform SSO
Yeah,
is coming to Jamf and all the other MDMs as well over time. Um, Microsoft will still own Entra AD, which is one of the IDPs that you can use for that technique. Intune just, for obvious reasons, I would guess with Entra, be the first MDM that natively have put this out into production, and therefore we are able with Intune to configure platform SSO. Uh, that is something that Jamf talked a lot about at the last JNUC, and I assume that we will get to know a lot more about that in October. But currently with Platform SSO, I think that will be able to take care of all of those capabilities for you, assuming that you have
gotcha.
Entra ID, that you deploy it with Intune today, and that you configure it correctly. You will be able, like I said before as well, have multiple accounts on the machine, but that will ensure that if you do that, you need to ensure that you assign your policies accordingly so that you don't get user assigned policies or profiles, especially on the device, which should be shared between multiple users. Then you need to use
Yeah,
device affinity instead, which, and just
that makes
to
sense.
get that out of the way, uh, Intune is built on user affinity. So you should try to assign as much as you possibly can. Scripts, profiles, applications to the users rather than the devices, even though you can do it to both. And there are good reasons to, in some instances, do it on a device affinity level. But in general, and that's the recommendation from Microsoft and from me and from many of the other MVPs as such, do use user affinity for as much as you can, because that will also speed up everything considerably
Yeah.
on all platforms.
Okay. When you say speed up, do you just
Mhm.
mean it's a better organizational system? Or if I deploy something to a single device or deploy it to a single user that happens to be assigned to that device,
Mhm.
that there's something in the back end that will actually make the assignment to the user go quicker?
Yeah, and I would say it's not necessarily so that the assignment to the user as such is quicker. Um, in most cases, you assign things to groups in Intune. You can do it on
Hmm.
individual devices or users as well, but in most cases, you do it to groups. When you have device groups, I tend to find that many of them are dynamic Entra ID groups. And dynamic Entra ID groups are usually, in comparison to everything else, very, very slow. And you don't like the actual SLA or SLO for Entra ID dynamic groups is 24 hours to update. It's very, very seldom that I've seen such a slow update cadence for them. But just imagine the worst possible scenario. You have a policy or a profile that you assign to a user group, or a device group.
Hmm.
you add a new device to that group. If you have the worst possible day in Azure, and it takes you 24 hours even to update the group membership, that will, of course, affect how fast it gets down to device. But then imagine that you miss the check-in for the device when it gets the profiles. Then it might take up to 8 hours again, depending on what kind of profile it is. At the best, and that's the default behavior, if you have a new profile, that should apply directly. It should push it out, but I've seen instances where it doesn't. If it's a change to a profile, that will wait until the next check-in to apply it. And then you might get into all sorts of timing issues. With the user, it's much, much faster. And the user groups are usually assigned and not dynamic, even though you can do dynamic user groups as well. So in general, both from a Entra point of view, because it's an integrated part of Intune, and from how Intune handles profile changes, I would always say that it's faster to do so. From a technical backend point of view, there's no reason why device targeted or assigned profiles wouldn't be as fast, but it's more in terms of all the steps that needs to happen for a device to get a new policy that it might be slower. And that's what I tend to find when I do Intune projects, regardless of platform, that, Intune is so slow. How do you deploy your profiles or your applications? We use device affinity. Change it to user, and you usually get to a much better state, which more reliable and more like shorter cadence for changes to happen. But with that said, do you remember what I mentioned there just briefly? A new profile will always be pushed, and a changed profile will wait for the next cadence. So take that into consideration when you work with profiles, regardless, again, of platform, that if it's something that needs to happen very, very fast, it might actually be more efficient to do that by creating a new profile, or by using bulk actions within Intune where you force a sync for all the devices.
Yeah, I noticed just while I was testing, because I was creating a firewall profile and I was trying out a different profile because it wasn't working. And getting that new profile to push was, I just had to I'm going to put my computer down for a couple hours and go do something else because it is not pushing. And I noticed the changes took I would just have to let it sit for a day and the change would eventually go. And there's nothing syncing or anything I would do that would make it a difference. Removing the profile and creating a new one sometimes would go a little bit faster, but it's still not that fast compared to Jamf. And this isn't even Jamf is 10 seconds at most, unless something's wrong. If something's wrong, it might take longer. But if we're talking about a configuration profile, it's less than 10 seconds typically. With Intune, it was I'd be sitting there for 10 minutes and it still wouldn't deploy. In the best of cases, and then in the worst of cases, it would be hours, which is annoying when you're testing.
Yeah, absolutely. And we could probably do an entire interview on just looking into those things. But in general, I think you have a very good point. And I think the way I usually explain it to people that have questions about why is this happening, if you look at Jamf or any of the other MDM vendors that have worked with any product for a considerable amount of time, many of them were built for an on-prem installation from the start. The underlying strategy and design were built for an on-prem environment, which meant that you could deploy it, and then it was up to whoever deployed it to ensure that it had enough compute resources to make it work for the expected performance they wanted and for the timings. Microsoft Intune is based to be a very, very large-scale MDM, and the current iteration of Intune is more than 10 years old today. And if you go back 10 years, especially in the US or Southern Europe or what it might be, internet connectivity were not as good as what we are spoiled with in the Nordics. And therefore the service was built to support all of this. So it's built to scale to hundreds of millions of devices.
Yeah. they were ahead of the
Yeah.
time with
Yeah.
cloud, because that would have been
Hmm.
2014. I remember Jamf Cloud
Yeah.
came out around that time too.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
yeah, when I started with Jamf, it was 2015, and Jamf Cloud had been
Hmm.
out for about a year, and it was
Yeah.
awful.
Yeah.
Had a lot of complications with it, with scaling that, bringing it in.
Mm.
I was teaching the courses at that time, and we would use
Mm.
only Jamf Cloud. We ended up
Yeah.
moving away from it because it was like so
Yeah.
bad. Because there was
Yeah.
these students in the middle of the test, they just like wouldn't be able to get into their server and all this stuff.
Mm.
So we're just going to set up we'll set up 18 local servers in a class, and it will work much
Mm.
better.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think that it's not saying that one or the other is better or worse. It's looking at where did they came from and how much have they re-architected
Yeah.
what they've done from the start. So if you look at things like Jamf Protect, which I believe is a cloud native service from the start, that's
Mhm.
much more scalable today than Pro still is. But
Mhm.
Intune is reworking a lot of those initial things they did, and that's only possible because of the like cloud native way it's built. That they are able to re-architect one of the largest cloud services there is, while they're running it for like hundreds of millions of devices.
Yeah.
But it also means that you have certain timings, certain ways it operates, that if you're not aware of it, you will end up in situations just as the one you described. And I think that
Mhm.
to like my point in terms of Intune, that's where I usually come in and help out organizations in saying, hey, if you do it this way, which is something I've learned over time, it will be quicker, it will work better. But a lot of organizations also stop there and just look at it and say, hey, it's slow. And I think it's important going both to Jamf and Intune that you look into what do you need, what do you actually need, what is good enough, and then
Mhm.
decide on the tool, but do ensure that you do it the proper way. And that goes for both of them. But today we are talking more about like the actual features, and that's something that has nothing to do with the underlying technology. But I do think that when you are evaluating whichever product, ensure that you're doing it under the best possible circumstances, and then choose your product based on the actual needs of the organization.
Cool. Well, I think that brings us straight into our third question, which is about Jamf
Hmm.
Protect. Um,
Hmm.
and now I just wanted you to compare and contrast Microsoft Defender for macOS with Jamf Protect.
Well, that it's a big question. I would say that when I have that discussion, it usually ends up in a much bigger context. I have a like when it comes to any EDR, let's start there. I can't say to anyone that Defender is the better endpoint detection and response tool compared to anything else. Just as I can't say that about CrowdStrike or Jamf Protect or whatever you
Yeah,
choose,
exactly.
because it's so complicated to compare EDRs because of many, many reasons. But if I look at Jamf Protect, the thing that really stands out in a positive way compared to Defender is obviously the native integration into macOS. It understands
Hmm.
the operating system. The compliance reporting, I think, is superb and fast on macOS. Microsoft is really catching up there, but I think like the simplicity, the performance, and the compliance reporting on macOS is great. That combined with the threat intelligence that the threat lab at Jamf does obviously make it, to me, like if you run a lot of Macs, I don't see why you would choose anything other than Jamf Protect in an isolated instance. So compliance reporting, performance, knowledge of the operating system, and the ability to integrate and get the information first from the threat lab, I would say are the main things. Then you obviously have the integration with Jamf Pro, which is great in terms of how you can do remediations if things happen. That is something that, again, gets up to a point like speed that Intune can't do. But if you at the same time compare Protect to Defender, Protect as such don't have any response built into it. it's dependent on
Hmm.
Pro to do response, where Defender have response built in for all platforms. You can isolate, you can do a lot of things in terms of forensics, stop things, grab files. So from that point of view, Defender is a more complete product in terms of an EDR, because you get everything inside the same solution. So I think that those are like the main differences that I see. But zooming out a bit on that, when I get to organizations with, if you only have Mac, then I would say go for Jamf Protect and Jamf Pro, because it will be a great experience. But there are very few organizations that only have Macs or have a majority of Macs, especially in my local market. And then you get up into a situation where you have both Windows and Mac, and then it gets more complicated, because one of the key things about security today, and if you want to talk about zero trust, is visibility and being able to overlook like a big estate of an infrastructure with as
Hmm.
few tools as possible. That's where Defender, which covers like all of the commonly used operating systems on the market, have an edge. Now I know
Hmm.
that Jamf Protect have extended to Windows and to other operating systems as well. But then you get into the same situation where I haven't tried Protect on Windows yet, but I would doubt that we would see the same benefits that Jamf have on Mac. Microsoft should obviously have on Windows. So where you get to the situation, I don't want to have two EDRs, and therefore most of my customers go for Defender, because it's, again, good enough on Mac and very good at Windows and a lot of other things. So from a
Hmm.
feature point of view, when you talk about Jamf Protect, you have the compliance, you have the performance, you have the knowledge, you have the threat analytics, which is great. On the downside is that you lack the native response features compared to Defender. Defender have a broader support. But what I then say to my customers, if they have a larger amount of Macs, especially if they are an organization which is more likely to be targeted by a cyber attack, do use Protect, as long as you use Microsoft Sentinel or any other CM on top of that, so you get that single pane of glass. But that in turn might cost more. So I think the Protect versus Defender discussion is more challenging than Intune and Jamf Pro,
Yeah.
because they have a more native integration. And when you use Protect and Defender side by side, you need to have something that combines them, and that might impact the total cost of whatever you're doing, because most organizations also license Defender on a per user basis. There are other things within those licenses which users of macOS still needs, and then it gets a very hard sell to also sell them a second EDR on top of everything they already
Yeah.
have.
Cool. Thanks for that answer. Just to summarize it a little bit, um,
Yeah.
Jamf Protect plus Jamf Pro, since it can kind of do the remediation
Mm-hmm.
along with the detection, is technically probably a better solution for macOS than
Mm-hmm.
Microsoft Defender. But with an EDR solution,
Yeah.
having a single pane of glass for all your devices is really important, and that's where
Mm-hmm.
Microsoft Defender really shines in a mixed
Yeah.
environment. So if you
Yeah.
have both Mac and Windows devices, then it's probably best to go with something universal like Microsoft Defender. But it also
Yeah.
could be good to run Microsoft Defender side by side with Jamf Protect, since Jamf Protect has a lot of compliance and reporting features that
Mm-hmm.
Microsoft Defender just doesn't have. However, of course,
Yeah.
licenses costs come into play.
Yeah. And just to add to that, I think that was a great summary. If you want to run two EDRs, ensure that you have that single pane of glass in your CM, so security and information event management solution. It could be Splunk, it could be something else too. But I do think Sentinel today especially with the just announced integration to Microsoft Security Copilot for Jamf Protect, is the obvious choice. And then you could probably focus your upskilling of your security team on Sentinel and Security Copilot, rather than focusing on having two different EDR solutions. So there are options which could give you the best of both worlds. Yep.
Awesome. I think that was a very good answer. And it's nice to have someone with more of a security background, because oftentimes us Mac admins are like, we just do whatever the security team tells us to do.
Yeah. And again, that's why I have a very long title, but I'm very proud of being a combined security and workplace architect, because in my opinion, that's what you need to have. Like, you need to be aware of both sides, and security, we can talk about security teams for ages, but I do think they have a similar challenge, that it's so easy to secure something if you have no clue about how it actually will impact whoever is using the solutions later on. And that's what I see when I get to organizations with like a lot of Macs, and you have a very Windows focused security team, and they try to like apply the same kind of security practices on macOS as they do on Windows. Yeah. And that is a 100% bulletproof way to fail with both security and your user experience on Mac. You need to apply the appropriate security strategy to each of these platforms, because they are in some ways fundamentally different.
Yeah, exactly. The main thing people talk about is like binding the Macs to AD. It's like it's not the same thing. Just because it has the same word does not mean it operates the same. Yeah.
Exactly.
On a side note, and this isn't the discussion for this, if you have information on this, I'd love to talk to you in a different interview sometime to go over like how to harden an MDM server from a security perspective, and all that type of stuff. But I don't know if you have expertise in that type of area. Yeah. Maybe that's one of our future meetups or something like that.
Yeah, I think so, because you do it in different ways, but the fundamentals are the same. Like, I think there are some things I do for every single Intune implementation I do, which is applicable to any MDM really. So it's definitely something we could do. Absolutely.
Another discussion though. Let's get through the Intune questions first. Okay, so my next question is going to be on conditional access. So I'm curious how both conditional access and device compliance, if you're managing a computer in Intune, is similar or different from just the device compliance or conditional access integration in Jamf Pro. Probably just focus on the device compliance integration in Jamf Pro, since the conditional access one is now deprecated.
Yeah. And this is one of the topics I'm most engaged in, and which is again why I always tell organizations that you should always go for Jamf and Intune when you manage macOS. So let's start with compliance first, because that will build up into conditional access later on. So device compliance from an Entra /Intune point of view, because you actually set the compliance state on the Entra, so the former Azure AD object, and not really the Intune objects, even though when you use Intune, it will be visible in both. Device compliance is all about looking into the device and see, does this device follow the basic security requirements we have for it? That might be that it has file vault enabled, that gatekeeper is in a certain state, that it might have a certain level of threat on it based on Defender or Jamf Protect, whatever. All of that adds up to, is this device compliant or not? If the device, and that is set on the Entra object, this is really what the integration between Jamf Pro and Intune does. Because with Intune, if you use only Intune, you are limited to what you can report on. And you also have the challenges of the infrastructure that Intune is built on, that it might take up to 8 hours for the device to report a configuration change. So worst case, you have an attacker. That attacker gets access to this device and turns off Gatekeeper. It might take up to 8 hours for Intune to realize that Gatekeeper is off, change the compliance state, and then apply the conditional access policies accordingly. This is where the Jamf integration comes into play, because the current iteration of that means that Jamf Pro controls and reports everything on the device. The Intune aspect of that is only there as an integration engine and identity broker on the device. So what will happen is that Intune registers the device within Entra AD. And it does things with Intune on the side, but it's really not important in the bigger context. So the device is now visible as a device object in Entra. Then Jamf, based on whatever configurations you have set up using smart groups and hardware inventory or attributes or whatever you want to use, starts to report on that configuration. And if something changes, so it's out of compliance, Jamf will send that information using an API to Entra and change the compliance state. And when I've used this, that takes somewhere between 30 to 90 seconds, around a minute to do, which in many cases is like fully acceptable from a security point of view, even though it, in the worst possible cases, might be too slow as well. But that's the like main selling point when I talk about this to my customers and to the community. You have up to 8 hours with Intune and very limited configuration options. If you integrate Jamf Pro with Intune, you are down to, at the most, 90 seconds and unlimited configuration options. You can report on whatever you like to set that compliance state.
So you're saying that the device compliance integration in Jamf Pro is better than the built-in conditional access and device compliance within Intune?
Compliance, yes. We haven't really gotten to conditional access yet.
Okay.
Because conditional access is what... Yeah. Go ahead.
So the device compliance integration in Jamf Pro is better than the native device compliance built into Intune.
Yes, by far. And it actually also, and I think this is the which I like to tease Microsoft about, the integration that Jamf and Intune does, the compliance reporting with Jamf Pro, is actually considerably better than what Microsoft does for Windows, because Windows have the same limitations. The only difference between macOS and Windows when it comes to compliance is that in Windows we can use custom compliance, so where we can report on wherever we like, but you're still down to those 8 hours of reporting. So with Jamf Pro and Intune, it's much better than both Windows and macOS.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, and then to tie this together with conditional access. So conditional access is, again, a feature that you can configure both through Entra and Intune. It's the exact same infrastructure. It's just two different ways of looking at it. In conditional access, you have the ability to have compliance as a condition, which means that the most simple way of explaining it is you try to reach Outlook Online, so your Exchange Online server where you want to read your emails through a browser. If you use conditional access, you can tell Entra that if this user tries to sign in from a device that is compliant, allow the user to sign in. If the user tries to sign in to Exchange Online from a device that isn't compliant, block the sign-in. And that's the entire purpose of compliance. This was one of the things that I didn't get my head around at the first when I started with Intune. Why do we have compliance profiles? It does nothing. But then you realize
Mhm.
that it drives that entire conditional access engine, which is one of the absolute core features of Microsoft's security solutions and a very unique feature to Microsoft since they own Entra as such.
Mhm.
So compliance is used to allow or disallow or put additional requirements on authentication to cloud services and to some extent also on to on-prem applications or access, or for the matter, network access.
Cool.
Yeah.
Um, let's dive into the next question.
Mhm.
So, kind of looking into some reporting features within Intune, is there anything similar to like patch reporting in Jamf Pro inside of Intune for third-party applications?
No. So that's also a difference in terms of platform. So when it comes to patch reporting on anything, in like Intune is in charge of installing things, and
Hmm.
Intune will let you know if it has successfully installed the last thing you instructed it to install. That might be patches, applications, whatever it might be. It has no understanding of if that is the latest patch or not. For
Hmm.
Windows, that's a bit different, but for applications or for macOS updates or iPad or iOS updates or whatever it might be, the only thing it knows is I was instructed to install this patch or the latest available patch that I can see in the service, and I have either successfully done that or failed to do so. It's
Hmm.
not aware of if the last thing you instructed it to do were the last thing that is like released. And for that, Microsoft instead positions Defender for Endpoint. So Defender for Endpoint will be able to report on you have an outdated Safari or you have an outdated Adobe Acrobat Reader on your Mac OS, which includes these CVEs and impacts this amount of devices. So the structure that, or the flow that Microsoft sees in this is that you have Defender for Endpoint, which reports on that you're outdated for this particular app. Then Defender for Endpoint, either through an administrator or through automated workflows, will instruct Intune to remediate by installing something else on that. And that's, if you use native Microsoft solutions, that would be something like Enterprise App Management, which is a built-in third-party patching tool within Intune. So I think
Hmm.
that's like an important thing to remember when you look at the Microsoft security stack, the Microsoft management stack, that certain things that you might see, look at Intune and say, why isn't it here? It's actually existing in some other kind of product, which integrates very well within Intune. So natively in Intune, you don't have the same kind of reporting in terms of these applications are outdated. You only know
Hmm.
what you have deployed, and that's why we on Windows use third-party tools to do the same thing. But you don't have it built into the product as Jamf does. But Microsoft's play here is that you should then license Microsoft 365 E5 security. Then you get Defender for Endpoint, which will integrate into Intune, and then you get that full experience of vulnerability reporting, compliance, those things.
Perfect. Makes a lot of sense. And talking about, you know, since we're talking about patch management,
Mm-hmm.
Jamf also has app installers where I think
Mm-hmm.
there's like 180 titles now where you can
Yep.
just, through a couple of clicks, say, keep these applications up to date and deploy them.
Yep.
Microsoft seems to have something similar to that. It doesn't have
Mm-hmm.
nearly as many titles. It's basically
Mm-hmm.
just the Microsoft apps. Jamf actually has more app installer. Microsoft created app installers than Microsoft does. But
Mm-hmm.
for those like Microsoft Office applications. I think it's Microsoft Office, OneDrive,
Hmm.
um, and OneNote. I don't know. There's a couple ones. Is that basically the same as app installers, where it's just going to be like you set it up and it will just keep updating those applications as updates come out?
So if you use the native, because if you go into Intune and I want to deploy Microsoft 365 apps on macOS, you will always deploy the latest available package, and it will be configured the way you want it to be. Then what happens is you have two options, and this goes for all platforms in general. You configure a channel when you install or reconfigure it. So you select a channel for that, and that will keep it up to date using the Microsoft Update Manager, which is installed together with the Microsoft applications. Oh, it's not here. Then we'll get to the other point. So you select.
So this is the is
this
this
is the
what you're
built-in.
talking
Yeah.
about here? Where
Yes.
you go to
Correct.
Microsoft Apps, you go here,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I would assign it to all devices.
Yeah.
And this, so I mean, this will deploy the latest version. Is it going to
Yes.
keep it up to date as well?
Intune won't, but Office will do it on its own. So when this is installed on the Mac, you will get this
Gotcha.
Microsoft automatic update manager, or whatever the name is on Mac. That
Yep.
will use the channel of Office that you configure, and you could do that through the Office. What's the name of that? You have an Office update service engine that you can use, and then Office will keep itself updated. So you don't really have to care about it, and you can configure that through the Microsoft 365 app configurations,
Yeah.
which is in another portal currently. But then it will
Gotcha.
keep itself updated.
So
The same goes for Teams. The same goes for OneDrive. So it will keep them automatically up to date, and it will always install the latest available Office application when you use this. So let's say that you configure the Microsoft 365 apps now. 3 months later, you add a new Mac to the same group, that will get the latest available Microsoft 365 apps installed, not the thing you configured 3 months back.
Gotcha. So this is working very differently than app installers, whereas app installers is actually has a whole process in place to update applications that's very robust. And that's why they can just keep adding more software titles, because all they need to do to add stuff to that process is find some source online where they're able to pull the latest version and then create a system for downloading it, uploading it to Jamf Cloud, and then doing some testing to make sure that nothing goes wrong. Whereas all Microsoft's doing is deploying the latest version and then utilizing its own installer mechanism. Microsoft Auto Updater is what it's called, but utilizing Microsoft Auto Updater to keep those up to date. And I'm sure Defender has its own thing that it does in the back end.
Yeah. Defender does its own thing, so that's a completely different channel, but it in practice works the same thing. It has its own updater that is decoupled from Defender or Intune. In terms of other apps, for Windows today, Microsoft have the Enterprise App Management service that it's an add-on to Intune, which will do a similar thing as Jamf is doing. I tend to use another third party to do the same thing for Windows. And for Mac, if I needed something similar to that with only Intune, I would use like Monkey or similar. But the way you compare app installers for Mac, it's very similar to what Microsoft is doing with Winget for Windows, which also is an online repository. But natively for Mac OS, there is nothing from Microsoft today. And there are probably reasons for it, but nothing that I'm aware of will be out in the near future either.
Yeah, I'm sure it's just a lot of investment. Jamf spent a lot of time getting app installers in place.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they basically just bought another company to develop it.
Yeah.
In the end. Okay. Next question. And this might be a loaded one, so feel free to just say this is too long of an answer. But can you give us any information on how the antivirus policy works in Intune?
I think you need to be more specific on what you want to know. It's like it's nothing that I can't answer probably, but it depends on the depth
Yeah,
of it
I'm
and what you're curious about.
I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen so
Yep.
that you can see it.
Hmm.
Okay, so if I go to Endpoint Security
Hmm.
and I go into Antivirus,
Hmm.
this is where I was like looking at this and I'm like, I feel like I'm a bit out of my depth here as I go to set up
Hmm.
this policy.
Hmm.
So I'm going to go to create here. Just call it test. So enable, disable cloud delivered protection. So is
Mm.
this like, I guess antivirus, when I think of antivirus, I think of like, you know, 15 years ago when we used to scan our computers once every week or month, and it would come up with so
Hmm.
many viruses and we'd have to quarantine them and do all this stuff.
Hmm.
It's not really something we commonly do nowadays anymore.
Hmm.
But I'm just kind of curious if that works like this, if it's a little bit different. How does this compare to endpoint protection? Is it the
Hmm.
same thing?
Great question. So, um, if you look at Defender for Endpoint, there are
Mhm.
actually different kinds of SKUs, so different kinds of licensing for that. But all of them includes the antivirus engine because all EDRs, regardless of who manufactures them, have an antivirus part of it. Because like we can't remove antiviruses. It's a relatively performance effective way of finding known malware. So if why would you use the more complicated and advanced and cumbersome EDR solution to look at the behavior if you already know that this file is malicious? So all EDRs have an antivirus solution built into them. So for this to actually do anything, you need to deploy Defender for Endpoint as well.
Mhm.
Then you can actually, if you go down a little bit on here in here, you have a passive switch. So enable passive mode. It's now deprecated, but that was there to ensure that you actually could use something else in addition to Defender for Endpoint on the same
Gotcha.
device. So where you might have Jamf Protect, but you also want the antivirus engine from Microsoft for whatever reason, then you could run them side by side, but where the EDR components would be disabled. So see this as your capability of configuring Defender for Endpoint and the antivirus components of Defender for Endpoint on macOS. So it's nothing that it wouldn't deploy just the regular Defender. You would still need Defender for Endpoint for it to run. The
Yeah, and I
other
guess
thing, yeah, go ahead.
that's another question I have is because you keep saying Defender for Endpoint,
Mhm.
but that is different than the Microsoft Defender I'm deploying through here, right? Oh wait, no, I do have Microsoft
Oh, that's
Defender for
yeah,
Endpoint.
yeah. Because
So I
I
guess
don't
that's
think I have. Yeah, I haven't seen that you only could get Microsoft Defender, so the actual antivirus that's built into Windows. To the best of my knowledge, it's not available on Mac OS, um, because that would be Windows Defender.
mhm.
So when you deploy
Gotcha.
Defender for Endpoint, that's actually the full EDR solution from Microsoft, and the capabilities that are inside of it will be dependent on the license you have assigned to the user of Defender for Endpoint. And then you have different levers that we shouldn't go into here, but to deploy the same agent, it will be locked down to whatever features you have licensed, and you can configure that using Microsoft Intune. And also do then configure the antivirus part of it. The thing to note here is that just imagine that you have Jamf Pro deployed to a device integrated with Intune, but it's Jamf Pro that controls everything on that device. Your security departments have then said that, yeah, you can use Macs, we manage them with Jamf Pro, but you need to install Defender on them. How do you then manage Defender? And here we have a little neat feature that enables Defender to talk to Intune. So that's how I manage my Mac. I have it enrolled into Jamf Pro, integrated with Intune, but Defender is managed by Intune. So if you look in your device list, you will actually see that it says, because if you do the current integration between Jamf and Intune, you won't see your Macs within Intune at all. They won't be there. They will only be in Entra. But if you deploy Defender for Endpoint to them, they will actually show up. But under Managed By, it will say MDE, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. And then you can configure the exact same configuration that you just showed, apply it to the devices that is managed by Jamf Pro, but still have the full management capabilities of Intune when it comes to Defender.
That's interesting. Does that only work if you have the device compliance integration?
Nope, it does work for everything. No? So you don't have to integrate it with Intune at all.
Yeah. You just deploy Microsoft Defender through Jamf Pro, and then you can manage Microsoft Defender from Intune.
Yes, correct.
Interesting. That's kind of cool.
Yep. And that's the exact use case they want to get at, both for Windows, for Linux, for macOS.
So Microsoft Defender is a pretty cool application for macOS, especially because it works across all the other platforms. Whereas Intune for managing macOS is like, if you have no other options, maybe this is good to go with.
Yeah.
But it's not really the best solution.
No. It's good enough for some organizations. But again, as soon as you get into the more complex scenarios, you will either have to be very good at scripting or using third-party tools, or just use Jamf and everything will work out for you.
Yeah. Okay, I think I have some quicker questions that hopefully won't take too long to answer. So I'll go through those. So first of all, can Intune integrate with an identity provider other than Azure AD, or are you locked if you're using Intune into using Azure? Entra AD.
Yeah.
I need to stop saying Azure.
Well, that's fine. I'm still saying both. So, and I think we will do that. That's what happened to Intune. It was officially called Microsoft Endpoint Manager for about 2.5 years, and then Microsoft and the rest of the world realized that people will never ever stop calling it Intune. So we'll see how it goes for Entra AD or Azure AD.
And then they went back to So is Intune now? I'm getting distracted, but is SCCM the same as Intune? I've always been confused by SCCM, Intune, Microsoft Endpoint Manager, System Manager. I'm so confused. What is actually what?
Yeah. Let's do a quick recap and explain all of those things then. So SCCM has actually not been called SCCM for 10 years. But that's how it started. So it was used to call System Center Configuration Manager. Then Intune has always been a side-by-side product or solution to that. But there are ways you can integrate Config Manager, which is currently it's Microsoft Configuration Manager is or I think it's even Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager, which is the official name for it now. You can integrate Config Manager and Intune into something called co-management. And then you get the best of both worlds. You can do some things on-prem, you can do some things in the cloud, and some integrations in between them. But it's never been the same product. But it's the same product team at Microsoft that develops both. So it started off as System Center Configuration Manager, SCCM. Everyone still from time to time calls it SCCM. That's the heart and soul of many of us that started off in that industry. Then the intention were to make Intune and Config Manager more integrated, therefore Microsoft Endpoint Manager. And then you had Microsoft Endpoint Manager, which were Intune, and you had Microsoft Endpoint Manager Configuration Manager, which is a stupid name, but that was what Config Manager were called. And then they realized that this doesn't work at all. They changed the name back to Microsoft Intune on one end and Microsoft Configuration Manager for what was back in the days called System Center Configuration Manager. So when we say Config Manager or SCCM, that's the same thing, and that's the on-prem management solution for today, only Windows and Windows Server. Microsoft Intune is the cloud service, and you can combine these two in co-management, where you then can manage Windows devices partly with Intune and partly with Config Manager.
Okay, that kind of clears it up.
It's absolutely fine. It's you are not the only one that have had questions about it, and even like Windows administrators are very confused by all of this. But I think Microsoft now knows what they should stick at.
Yeah. So back to my question that I was asking, and I'll ask it properly this time. Can you integrate Intune with an identity provider other than Entra AD?
No, not what I've seen. Or like you could obviously add something in front of Entra. So I guess that you could use Okta to do some things, and then using Okta have some single sign-on thing to Intune. But I've never seen it done. And I'm like, there are no official ways of doing it. But whatever you choose to sign into Entra might be something else. Because I have definitely seen organizations that use Okta in front of Entra to do certain things. But natively, like if you want to get groups from something other than AD or Entra ID, that is not supported.
Yeah. Next question. Is there any local log file on a computer for Intune?
Yes, there is. I'm happy to find it for you. But yes, there are local logs. You can actually even collect them in a very odd way from Intune, but you need to know where they are first. So I will see if I can find the exact place where they are at.
Yeah, you can get back to me later on that. I don't need that on the call. I just wanted to know if there was one.
Yes, there are local log files.
Yeah, perfect. I'll look into those later. Next question, kind of similar. Is there any local way to like run the binary like you can with Jamf Pro? I can run like sudo Jamf policy. They're like sudo Intune policy.
No, not to my knowledge. You can trigger that through the portal, though. I think you should be able to do it locally, but I haven't done it. I tend to do it through the console. To be completely, like, to the best of my knowledge, you can't do it through the terminal, but you can do it through company portal. So if you go into company portal, you can force a sync from company portal. I think you should be able to do it through the portal as well, but I've never really found a use case for it. So what I tend to do is either use company portal, sync it through there, or trigger it through a remote device action from the Intune console.
Gotcha. And the remote device action, just to make sure I'm talking about the same thing. So is this, I'll just share my screen. Easier.
Yep.
Oh, I didn't share it. There we go. Okay. So I'm on the device. There's this sync command. Is that what you're talking about? Or are you talking about something different? Just this one right here. That's the remote command you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. So sync will force
Perfect.
a sync of policies and application assignments and everything there is.
But so just to clarify, that's not going to be quite as good as running something like Jamf policy, which forces it from the computer end, because you have to send a command from Intune to then force the computer to do it. And there's going to take a lot more time for that sync to happen.
Yeah, that's correct.
Gotcha.
And like it's pressing that will trigger the same thing as you would trigger locally on the device by pressing sync in the company portal. But it would still evaluate, like ask Intune for new policies, send it back, so it won't be as instant as the equivalent in Jamf.
Okay. Another question I have, and this is a little bit of a troubleshooting thing. I might start asking a few more troubleshooting questions. I was trying to get custom attributes working, and I couldn't get it to work, and I swear I have to be doing something wrong. So if I go to macOS custom attributes, I created, the world's simplest script. It says it's succeeded now. This is new. For the longest time, it just said 0 for succeeded or like pending, and I was like getting driven crazy. So we'll see if this. Okay, so I guess first of all, what does this do? Let's look. It's just going to report the last logged in user. That's all I'm doing. Is this written correctly from what you can tell?
Oh, that's a very good question. But yes, by the looks of it, it is.
It's just echoing logged in user. So that should be good as long as it echoes it to the terminal. So the next question is, where do I see this value?
That's actually a very good question. And to be completely honest, I have never used the attributes in Intune.
Oh, okay.
I know it's an essential bit in Jamf, but I've not used these in Intune. I think I've used it at some very odd point, but it's been years since I last used it. So I think one of the things that I noticed in your assignment, though, were that you had assigned that custom attribute to both users and devices. In theory, in theory, it should work, but I would try to avoid having both devices and users in the same assignment, and instead, rather, if you need to have both all users and all devices for whatever reason, do two policies instead, because that will help reporting as well. But again,
would you recommend? So I was just doing that because clearly I didn't know what I was doing. Would you recommend, kind of like you did at the beginning, where you say just scope to users, don't scope to devices?
Yeah. So the general rule is, if you can scope it to users, do that. But when it comes to assignments later on, it's important to remember that you should always try to, if you include users, don't mix that with devices. And if you have users, you can't exclude devices from that assignment. It will only work for one or the other. So try to avoid, try to be as clean as you can in your assignments, not mixing users and devices in the same assignment, and try to avoid conflicts as long as you can.
Gotcha.
And you actually saw, you were talking about local log files, and you actually were, when you looked at that attribute, you had collect logs. And in there you can add a file path or multiple file paths to the logs you want to collect. So you can actually collect whichever log you want. It's not necessarily only Intune logs, but if you do your own log files through the script or whatever you might do, you can collect all of those logs using Intune. It will package them into a zip folder, and you can then download it from Intune. So you can
Yeah.
use that to do a lot of other things.
Okay.
Yeah.
So still a little bit of a mystery on how to get this attribute, but and even how to use it, because part of the power of Jamf Pro is like you can do a custom extension attribute, and then you can base reports or even policies off of the results of that extension attribute. Whereas in Intune, I can't even figure out how to get it, and I'm pretty sure actually you can create a device group based on that. I did see that if I go to groups, you can create these dynamic groups, but you're kind of saying probably just stay away from anything device related, because I can do dynamic device.
Yeah, and then dynamic query.
Yeah, and then add a dynamic query, and there's some stuff here, but one of them is extension attribute, which is just named 1 through 15.
Yeah, and I think it's those are on the Entra AD object. So I don't think, and like I said, I haven't used custom attributes for macOS in I don't know how many years, but the attributes you see there, they are the custom attributes that you can add to the Entra object in Entra. So let's say that you provision this somehow. So it doesn't read anything on the local device. It expects those attributes to be populated by you on the device in Entra, not the local device.
Okay. So are you saying that this is not the custom attribute? This is something different?
This is something different, yes.
Okay. All right. That clears that up. Okay. Well, at least I got through that.
Yeah, you managed in the end somehow.
I found something that you couldn't answer.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me talk about some other things I'm having problems with. Import policy. That's something I was having problems with, and this is for a configuration file. So if I go to create, I can import a policy, and then I can drag it in here. I tried putting a mobile config file in here, and it did not work. And I can maybe try that again. But is this supposed to take a mobile config file?
Yeah.
Or should it be taking something else?
So
it should take a mobile config. It might have been because I downloaded it from Jamf. It might have been signed.
So there are two different ways. Here, import policy, you see that it says preview. And then you have an export in the actual profiles. So this import function is for exported profiles from a different Intune tenant.
Okay, so this is just Intune.
Yeah, but if you create a custom profile, then you should be able to import a mobile config. So if you go to templates, then you have custom.
Oh my! So this is so now I can do a mobile config.
Yeah, you should be able to do that. And then select the configuration profile.
Okay, let's see if I have one.
Let's see somewhere. If it works.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Test. And this one might not work well because
it
must be a well-formatted XML string. But okay, this is at least how I'm supposed to do it, and I can probably actually sign it and not do it through here. But
so that's the difference in between importing here is when you have exported an existing Intune policy and want to take that to another tenant. If you want to add custom mobile configs, then you use that through custom profiles within Intune. And funnily enough, the last thing I actually struggled to get to work were the exact same application that you just showed me. But I will speak to that customer next week and see if we've been able to do that with Intune.
Which one is that?
Global Protect.
Oh, Global Protect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I joke with them to say that, yeah, we have spent 10 Jamf licenses to get this to work with Intune. So we have almost up to the number of users that they are supporting with Intune in terms of just troubleshooting and getting things like that to
Yeah.
work.
Yeah, that's always fun.
So I actually did a quick Google on custom attributes, and the use case for it in Intune is to do custom reporting. So if you add custom attributes like you did, that will actually start to add to inventory in Intune. So that's the that's the use case of it. You can't use it for anything else.
So, okay. So it gets added to the inventory, but where do I find it in the inventory?
So I think now this is an old page I'm reading from, but if you go to if you go to custom attributes, the thinking here is if you go in there and then you use device status, you can actually see your result.
Oh, I see it there.
Yeah. And if you then have multiple macOS devices, you will see that result for everything. And then you can use...
isn't, yeah, it's like you got to go into the attribute to view it, and yeah, you can't do any more reporting with it. So it's a little limited, but...
Yeah. But then we clarified that, and I got to remember what the use case were for it.
Okay, I should have seen that because I was right in front of my eyes the entire time.
Yeah, but at the same time, if you only have one device, it doesn't make too much sense, because then you get the same kind of reporting. If you had multiple devices, well, then you get to see more things.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, my next question is going to be about another thing I've been having a lot of issues with, and that is just getting this device file vault encrypted. And I'm just going to ask you about this because I feel like I'm going crazy because it's such a simple thing to do and it is not working. I'll explain what's happening. So I have both of these profiles. One to do it during the setup assistant. And this is on the computer I'm testing on is on Sonoma, so that should work. And then one just to force it after the fact. What happens, so in Jamf Pro, what happens, if I do it through the setup assistant, that works how it should. Otherwise, we'll just focus on the second one. If I deploy it the other way, either it's going to prompt me to enable File Vault when I first log in, or it's going to prompt me to enable File Vault when I first log out.
Yes.
One of those two things is going to happen. With Intune, what has been happening is I get this pop-up while I'm logged into the computer. FTE setup would like to enable File Vault. And I can click OK, and I can click Don't Allow. Neither of those buttons File Vault encrypt the computer. And I have not been able to enforce File Vault encryption in any way because of that. And it doesn't prompt me when I log in or when I log out. It does it when I'm currently logged in at just a random time, and it'll do it multiple times. I see this pop up all the time when I'm testing.
Yep. So let's first look at one thing that I noticed. Can you go to devices? Yep.
Right here?
Because your device were non-compliant. If you check on compliance policies to the left, not that far, there. Yep. Up. There.
Compliance policies.
Yes.
Sometimes I can't see.
Yeah, no worries. And click that. Properties. Or you can do per setting status. Let's see. It doesn't really matter. Require encryption of data storage on devices. So What
Okay.
I think is happening in this instance is that it wants to report on your device, and because the device doesn't have firewall currently, right? Therefore, the device is not
Hmm.
compliant.
Yeah.
So the reason why you get that pop-up is that Intune tries to figure out is firewall enabled or not.
Gotcha.
But the compliance policy won't, it's on its own, enable firewall. So that's why you get the pop-up. If you then go back to the devices, we can, or you go to the profile where you configure firewall, and we can check on what's
Okay.
happening there. In general, I would say that the way I've done it for existing devices, because that's where we usually see it.
Yeah, I have a
Yeah, we have
conflict here now.
yeah. Let's see what that says. And click that, the name of the device.
Yep. So is the
Once
conflict because I have these two file vault profiles?
if you click on the device name, it should open up so we can see what's.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, and we can probably look into that. I would guess based on the conflict that it's due to you having two different profiles. And then we can, and they probably have settings that aren't or that are colliding with them, so it's not the same kind of setting. But again, like I said previously, if you're used to working with GPOs or any other MDM for the matter, conflicts is something you're used to. In Intune, it doesn't work out too well. So try to avoid any kind of conflict you can with policies or assignments. Now,
So it
this
looks
one
like
isn't.
right now I don't even have it assigned anything.
Yeah. But that doesn't mean that it's removed from the device, because that's also could be a different behavior, which is the same on Windows. Some settings aren't removed when you remove the actual configuration. So that could be one thing. Do also, if you go back once, you will see another thing that's different. If you look at the policy type, you have settings catalog on FileVault, and you have endpoint protection. So
Hmm.
endpoint protection is basically just if you, the reason why you have two different kinds is that if you have a security team that is in charge of security on the devices and a device management team, you need to be able to differentiate who can set which policy. So that's why you have the endpoint protection part in Intune, because you should, and I think you had a question on scope tags later on. This is where it comes into play,
Yep.
and the role assignments of the devices. So these settings configure the exact same configuration on the device, but it's two different areas of Intune because you might want to differentiate who can do what with what setting. A security team, a device
Hmm.
management team. That's why you have two. But if you do two policies, it will create a conflict, and then things will start to fail and break. So that's why you need to be aware of that. You can configure the same policy in 3 or 4 different places. It's still the same setting that is configured on the device, and those conflicts aren't too good. So what I tend to recommend is that if you have security settings, either use the settings catalog or use the configurations within endpoint security. Do not mix them.
Gotcha.
But if you go
Okay.
into
So
FileVault here,
I'm doing things the wrong way. Yeah.
and here, as you see, we have the same kind of conflict, so we can go down and just see the assignments first. And there we have all devices, which is what I would expect for a device, for a disk encryption setting. That's the only thing I tend to do on a device level, both for BitLocker for Windows and FileVault for Mac, so it's nothing odd there. So if we go to configuration profiles and that firewall policy, and we go down and look at the configuration settings, that looks good. You have actually disabled prompt at signout.
So maybe I
So
should
I would
not
set that.
configure that.
No, because then I don't know how that will happen actually. So I would say that this is the general configuration that I have, that you should ask the user to enable it at signout. and then number of times allowed to bypass, that might be different depending on how you want to do it. So I would say 1 or 2 probably, so that they might have the opportunity to do things differently, and then review and save. Then it should hopefully work. There are some other things we could have changed in the profile, but this will probably help you to fix it. Now, remember, since we changed a policy, it won't automatically be pushed to it. So you will have to sync it either through the device actions or through company portal.
Yeah. We won't do that on this call since we're in the last 3 minutes.
Yeah.
So instead, I think we'll wrap things up. Simon, this has been an amazing interview with a lot of great information. So thank you so much for joining us. Want to give you a quick chance to plug your podcast, because I know you have one, and anything else that you're doing that people can find you at.
Yep, absolutely. So you can listen to me and my co-host podcast, Knee Deep in Tech. It's on all places you can find podcast. We talk about technology in general, but with a big focus on Microsoft and how to get actual value from technology. So please tune in there. You will be able to find me on upcoming conferences. I can't disclose which, but you might find me sometime later this year, and I will be at several other locations during the year, both in the US and over Europe, to talk about Intune, to talk about Jamf and other things. I know that there are some webinars planned with Jamf in the fall as well, where you will be able to find me. And as always, please, if you have any questions following up on this, reach out to Christopher or reach out to me. You will find me on Twitter. I refuse to call it X, at BinderTech, or on LinkedIn. And I have a relatively uncommon name, so you will be able to find me, or ask your favorite generative AI engine about who I am, and you will be able to find me through that too. So thank you for inviting me.
Great. We're going to put a link to those in the description of this video. And Simon, we'd love to have you speak at our monthly meetup. I don't know if you've seen the Launchpad meetups, but if you ever have a topic you want to speak on, it'd be awesome to have a security person talk through security for Jamf Pro and stuff like that.
Yeah, happy to do it.
Great. Well, with that, we're at the end of our time, and I'm sure you have another meeting coming up right after this. So thank you so much, Simon. It's been great, and have a great rest of your Friday and a good weekend.
Yeah, you too. Thank you very much.
All right. Bye.